Alrighty, we're going to go ahead and get started. We need to give a really big shout out here to Scott Center. He's with the Fish and Wildlife Service down in Roseburg. His boss, Jim Threlkill, and Josh Chapman with the Umpqua National Forest were going to give this talk, but they both got pulled to the command performance with the chief and the Secretary of the Interior. So apparently he didn't run fast enough one afternoon when they were looking around to find who could take their place and make sure this talk happens, because I think it's a very important one. He is going to be talking about integrating the northern spotted owl critical habitat and forest management on the Umpqua National Forest Elk Creek watershed. So we've all been curious about this, what the CHU thing means, and these guys have taken a crack at it. So help me welcome Scott Center, please.
Thank you, Cheryl. I apologize for having a cold. If I could have done something about that, I would have. I hope my voice holds out. As Cheryl mentioned, Josh couldn't be here as much as he tried. I want to thank the two agencies that are contributing to this mostly. I want to thank the American public for funding this work. I want to talk about how the recovery plan and critical habitat, how we see them playing into planning efforts at watershed and other scales. We want to talk about some potential tools to use, but also I'm seeking input on other tools we can use or how we might use the tools that I'm going to show you in use could be used. I'm going to start out with just a little brief background. The overarching guidance and directive for the critical habitat designations and recovery planning is the Endangered Species Act of '73. As far back as then, they were suggesting that we need to think in large scales in terms of ecosystems. We don't always do that. When it came time to do the recovery plan, there were a couple of things afoot. One is some ecological forestry concepts that Drs. Franklin and Johnson were putting out and shopping around. And there was also the growing realization that the dry forests in the region are at an increasingly ever-growing level of risk to loss to wildfire. And that the way we've been doing things, the way we've been managing them is not really going to work in the future. So that plus climate change is looking like things are going to get even worse in that respect. So because of those driving forces, the people who put together the recovery plan as well as the critical habitat final rule tried to thoroughly embrace the idea of active management. This is probably the most important slide of this whole talk. It is the one thing I want you all to take home with you is the promise that we are trying to work with you all to figure out how to best manage these landscapes, especially within critical habitat. We're looking for opportunities to learn about how to better manage for spotted owl recovery, how to bring that about, as well as, and we think that it's closely tied to and just interlocked with our abilities to manage forest ecosystems so that they're healthy and resilient. These are the goals we go into, some of the primary goals we go into a project planning effort with. Restoration again. We heard restoration sort of redefined this morning as resilience, enhancing resilience, and I think that's quite appropriate here. So if I don't say that every time, that's usually what I mean. We aren't going to restore these landscapes to what they used to look like, but there's a lot of components out there that we know are important to things like spotted owls that we want to bring back, make more prevalent than they were before, or better protect them from things like wildfire. And of course, inputs to local communities the economies are incredibly important to all of us. We all live and work there, and some of us plan to retire there. You'll see this slide a couple of times. It's really more of a waypoint along the way, if you will, through this talk to help show how we envision stepping down planning from the regional scale down to stand level prescriptions. We think that different things are important to consider at different scales. For instance, at the regional scale, population ecology, disturbance regimes, we are hoping will go into regional level management decisions about forest restoration. We think scale is important. Again, we're going to talk about that several different, over and over again, if you will. We're going to talk about drilling down from the top as well as starting from the bottom, i.e. standing in your stand and discussing things that should be done or could be done at the stand level, and trying to reach a point where the top-down and the bottom-up views bring you to the same logical conclusion. The way the critical habitat rule was developed, I'm going to summarize about 5 years of work in about 2 sentences here. They took ecoregions, subdivided them into provinces based upon vegetation data, elevation data, what we knew about disturbance regimes and spotted owl ecology, to develop a critical habitat network of a little over 9.5 million acres in 11 units spread from Canada into California. You see Corvallis there, the Umpqua National Forest, and this right there is the watershed we were talking about. This critical habitat unit is the Klamath East. One of the things that we think makes sense to look at both the regional scale, and as you'll see, we think it comes into play even down as low as the watershed scale, is this idea of wildfire suitability. And I don't know all the details about how this was put together. There are people in the audience who can explain that to you, I'm sure. But one thing that is apparent at the regional scale is there seems to be a pretty strong correlation between areas that are considered suitable for large wildfires and the places that have actually had large wildfires. And another thing important to notice here is that given the different ranges, time spans there, you have a 32-year range on one side and a 6-year range on the other. The implication here is that there's an increase in the trend of frequency of large wildfires. The circle's around the area that we're focusing today. So you can see that it's an area that has had some large wildfires in the past and is still at risk of future wildfires. I'm not really sure why I put this in there other than to point out that, or try to drive home the point that it doesn't matter where you are within the range of the spotted owl, whether you're, like we are, lucky to be working up in this area where the populations may be closer to stable than they are in other places, or places where they're clearly not stable. Restoration is incredibly important no matter which part of the range you're working in. So for context for the Elk Creek watershed, again, we're in the Klamath East Critical Habitat Unit. There are 7 subunits within there. Oop, wrong button. And we're in Klamath East number 1. It sits entirely on the Umpqua National Forest. Get this straight here. The objectives that were set up for Klamath 1, they identified special management considerations and protections to address threats due to wildfire and past timber harvest and the effects of this fire, exclusion and competition from barred owls. And they point out that in the final rule, they also point out that the increase in enhancement in northern spotted owl habitat is necessary in this, as well as all of the other subunits of the Klamath East Critical Habitat Unit. Ideally, what we in our Roseburg field office hope to be able to do is get to a point in the near future where we can enter into discussions with managers about restoration priorities, equipped with analyses that are conducted at the subunit scale. What you'll see here in the next few slides is an example of a beginning of the type of analysis that we want to try to conduct. We're hoping to carry this through to fruition in timely fashion so that we can be involved in those future discussions. For this particular project, the decision was made to work in this watershed for other reasons prior to the finalization of the plan. So we didn't have the benefit of these subunit scale analyses. But one thing we would like to try to do is, as an example, is incorporate things such as this wildfire suitability mapping and the relative habitat suitability grids that were developed in part of the modeling, to support the modeling done in the critical habitat final rule. Put them together and see what shows up. In this case, this is my tickler for local knowledge is incredibly important. If you know this area, you realize that some of this stuff up here that's high wildfire suitability burned up in 2002. So it seems that it's suitable for wildfire because it has already burned and there's a whole lot of material up there ready to burn. But that doesn't mean that there's a lot of habitat up there. So we need to continue this analysis, incorporate in habitat and other local knowledge. But this is the scale that we would hope we could have discussions with managers and identify priorities instead of coming in after the fact when they say, okay, we decided to work in this watershed over here, what can you bring to the table? It works either way, but it's better in our view to have the discussions up front. This is just showing that we're stepping down from regional to watershed scales. I'm never going to trying to get to why are we doing this here and to get to the stand level prescriptions. When the Umpqua decided to work in this watershed, one of their first documents that they put out was this project initiation letter. As you can see that they fully embraced the idea of restoration, resilience, reference conditions. The reference condition in this watershed was one of broad hardwood forests, hardwood savannas, mixed conifer forests. It had a very strong prevalent influence of fire over the preceding eons. We don't anticipate that we'll be able to restore that at the landscape scale, but we are hoping that at the stand and the subwatershed scale, we can get it, move it back in the direction of historic reference conditions. So we'll talk a little bit about the watershed condition. You can see it's a forested landscape. A good part of it is critical habitat. I don't have ownership on here, but the vast majority of the Forest Service ownership in this watershed is critical habitat. So this, again, is a wildfire suitability map on here. We saw earlier that it was heuristic to look at it at the regional scale. We think it has value at the subunit scale. And here at even a finer scale, it seems to be providing quite a bit of insight. One thing to notice is the lack of roads in these areas that are coded as at high risk of wildfire, or highly suitable for wildfire, if you will. The ability of fire suppression to carry out its function is a driver in this model. So just like we did at the subunit scale, we've done the same thing at the watershed scale to put together wildfire suitability, relative habitat suitability, as well as actual habitat locations and spotted owl historic sites to pull together a mosaic compilation of data sets to get at priorities on the landscape. A couple things jump out here. One are areas, and I apologize for this, it should be down here. But these two areas are characterized by low wildfire suitability, but having reasonable amounts of habitat. We think that those have been historically, and therefore in the future will likely be best managed as habitat refugia areas. And the prescriptions one would develop in those areas differ from what we might develop in areas with lots of habitat, high habitat suitability, and high wildfire suitability. So we're taking data that we first looked at a larger scale and drilling down, and it still seems to make sense to use that same data at these finer scales. And we believe it's getting us to stand level prescriptions where we can successfully manage for these type of resources. Something else that's coming into play into how we will be developing prescriptions and where is this knowledge of how spotted owls tend to use the landscape based upon abiotic factors. We do know that they tend to prefer the lower and mid slopes. One explanation for this, or maybe it's something else that we see in the landscape that's due to the same causative factor, it's kind of a chicken and the egg type of question there, is these fire severity patterns that are also changing at different slope positions. As you can see, we have greater fire severity, tend to have greater fire severity up high and lower fire severity down low. Correlates well with the way spotted owls use it. I don't know if it's the causative factor, but it's all connected. So tried to give you an example of what we're doing, how we're applying some of the tools that we have available. We're just getting started on it. The rule was just finalized in December. We've been working on assessing the impacts of ongoing projects to that critical habitat in the meantime, and we're just about caught up there so we can get more into these kind of planning efforts. But I just wanted to give you an idea of what we are thinking about doing and how we're going about it. I want to leave you with the promise that we believe, if you will, that restoration and recovery are compatible. We think it's much easier to do that if we are integrated with the Forest Service and other action agencies, as well as collaborating with the public. And with that, I'll take any questions. Yes.
Within that Elk Creek planning area, how much of the habitat designation is actually suitable for owls currently?
Can you repeat the question, Scott?
Well, the question is how much actual habitat is there in the Elk Creek watershed?
And what percentage of the designated habitat is currently suitable, and then through restoration, how much of that will be brought along to be more suitable?
I don't have the actual figure there. I think it's in the range of 40 to 50% currently. That might be a little bit high though, but we do know that it's lower than we want it to be. We want to increase that percentage.
And I have a follow-up question.
Sure.
As you continue to move that habitat that's not currently suitable, are you all thinking about other ecological indicators beyond the spotted owl as to what might help us gauge whether we're successful in that restoration from an ecological, specifically the spotted owl ecosystem framework?
We'll repeat it again.
Let me see if I can. I think the question is, are we looking for other ecological values?
Or potential indicators of
As
the desired condition?
indicators.
That the owl might be.
The spotted owl habitat is one of the drivers, but it's not the only indicator that we're seeking to enhance out there. We see a lot of evidence of overtopped, crowded out black and white oak, for instance. We see a lot of ponderosa pine, mature ponderosa pine that are succumbing to diseases and other stresses due to competition from encroaching conifers. We see a lot of evidence of seed banks that once we disturb them from which will proliferate quite a few meadow herbs. So we have evidence that there used to be a widespread savanna there, and the various components of the savanna woodland are indicators that we're seeking to enhance.
Thank you.
Abe.
Okay, I don't want to give you too much of a hard time, but we've had a lot of these conversations already. So it sounds like with the recovery plan and critical habitat, recognizing this is an ecosystem view. If you're doing a stand-level prescription, there may be some winners like oak and pine and butterflies and things like that, or early cereal type species. But if you were to restore those, there's a loss, there's an impact, a negative impact to owls in the short term and maybe even the long term in that area. How does that play into your consideration? Knowing that you're trying to do restoration, there's winners and losers within the framework of the recovery plan and critical habitat, and the owl is the loser. And I've heard that this is okay if you're really doing it for a good reason, but I'm curious how you're evaluating that trade-off.
So the question, I believe, is how are we evaluating the trade-offs between winners and losers when looking at stand-level prescriptions?
If the owl's the
If
loser.
the owl is the loser and we're in designated spotted owl critical habitat, exactly. We do recognize that the critical habitat network encompasses and comprises a variety of habitat types and affords habitat for a wide variety of species. I think it harkens back as far as 1973 when they told us to manage ecosystems as opposed to managing for single species. We can't just, it's designated critical habitat for the spotted owl, so that has to be a major consideration. But we do recognize the variability out there. And we believe that if these ecosystems are resilient, and that means diverse, that the spotted owl will be better off in the long term. So what we look at is, when evaluating it at the stand scale, is whether it seems to make sense in the long term at the larger scale for the spotted owl and other late cereal species.
Yeah, and I guess because there's not a direct connection between, say, butterflies and savanna birds to owl success. But we recognize that those are important ecological features. There's no direct connection between their prevalence and.
Might be a connection to prejudice.
And yeah, I don't know. I mean, that was kind of where I was getting at. Do we have to have a direct link, or can we manage for these special things?
There's overlap. There's certainly overlap. For instance, sugar pines. One thing I've seen, just personal observation, is that if you want to go find gray squirrels in the forest, look for the sugar pines. That's a pretty big meal for a spotter, but they do take them. So another example are some of the deer mice and voles that are much more prevalent in those meadows and savannas. Spotters will eat those too. So it's not, we don't view them in any way as mutually exclusive.
Well, One more question?
You there?
Fish and Wildlife Service is clearly embracing active management to a degree that I haven't seen before. And I work for a conservation group, and I'm somewhat concerned about that. I'm wondering if it's really well supported as it's being purported. There are some really interesting studies of carbon storage in forests, and the results there show that if we're trying to log the forest to reduce fuels and modify fire behavior and store more carbon, it doesn't really pan out, except in ecosystems where it has a very frequent fire regime and you're doing very light treatments. Well, that sounds like a dry pine site that's not really spotted owl habitat, but when you have longer fire return intervals and more dense habitat, typical of spotted owl habitat, you're not storing more carbon. And it seems very applicable to this situation with spotted owls. And I'm just wondering if that kind of analysis has been done in this context.
You guys looked at carbon.
We have not specifically looked at carbon, but those kind of considerations are certainly in the forefront of our minds when we think through this. I want to point out that spotted owls are using a range of habitat types from the wet, classic, high carbon storage refrigerators that we have on, say, the west coast of the Olympic Peninsula through very dry forests, say, over on the east side of the Klamath. And yes, it makes more sense to implement restoration that might remove material from the drier forests than it does from the wet. But also that we believe there's a lot of catching up that needs to be done to make these drier forests more resilient, and sadly that's going to involve removing some of that material that we might not otherwise do if we were just looking at it from a carbon standpoint. But thank you for reminding us to look at that.
Thank you, Scott. We need to move on. Stay tuned, the EA for that project will be coming out, in the not too distant future. Suzanne, you here? She's an acting planner on the Umpqua going, don't ask me anything.